Of course, the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine has led to numerous other questions. One of those questions is the idea of other countries joining NATO and perhaps the security threat that Russia may pose to other countries. And joining me now to discuss all of those things is Alexander Stubb. He is the former Prime Minister of Finland. Prime Minister, thank you very much for joining me. Perhaps we can start out with the idea that I mentioned in the introduction of of other countries potentially joining NATO. Do you see right now as a time that Finland should be considering joining NATO?
Yeah, definitely, and it's going to happen. And basically, you could say that really Putin has pushed Finland to join NATO. You know, we used to be 50% against, 20% in favor. The latest opinion poll that came out today, we're now 68% in favor and 12 against. So I think within a few weeks, we'll be north of 80% in favor, and Finland will file an application for NATO membership sometime in the month of May, and will end up joining this year.
And on the piece that I mentioned in the introduction about the threat that Russia may pose to Finland, how big of a threat do you think Russia poses to Finland, and do you fear that Russia could do the same thing they're doing in Ukraine to potentially other democracies?
Well, not to Finland. I mean, we don't know about Georgia and Moldova, but not to Finland. There's no imminent threat. You have to remember that we have obligatory military service. I did mine way back then in the 1980s. We have 900,000 reserves, and we can mobilize 280,000 men and women within a matter of days. On top of that, we have over 60 F-18 planes. We just bought another 64 F-35s. We have very good defense mechanisms. So I think what we'll probably end up seeing is sort of these hybrid or cyber attacks when Finland files for membership. I'll give you one example. President Zelensky spoke to the Finnish parliament last Friday, and simultaneously when it happened, the homepages of the Finnish Defense Ministry and Foreign Ministry went down because of a Russian cyber attack. But a military attack, I just don't see that in the cards.
And so maybe talk about, the potential cyber, threats and how they relate to, the actual threat of what's happening in Ukraine right now. I mean, how do you compare the two things?
Well, they're very different, because what we're seeing in Ukraine is, of course, conventional warfare. People dying, if not by the minute, at least by the hours. Their tanks, their missiles, their guns, their bombs. Whereas hybrid and cyber attacks, they're this sort of, more difficult to conceptualize warfare. I keep on saying that everything has become weaponized. So you can kind of use, the internet, you can use information, you can use energy, you can use sanctions as a weapon. So that kind of stuff we'll see coming from Russia, but no sort of military kind of attacks.
And do you think, obviously, one of the main things that we've seen is, NATO obviously showing their support to Ukraine, and a large portion of other countries in Europe showing their support to Ukraine as well. We've heard a lot throughout this war about how Russia is powerful, but when you put a bunch of other democracies together, it can basically become just as powerful as Russia. So on that idea, how important is it for other democracies to, work together? And do you foresee if, NATO, for example, were to actually get physically involved in this conflict, do you think that the conflict would end sooner, and how so?
No, I don't think NATO will get involved physically. I mean, what NATO member states and European member states and the US and Canada do is to send weapons so that the Ukrainians themselves can fight the war. I think what we'll end up seeing is sort of a new Iron Curtain between Russia and the rest of the West. So you have an authoritarian, totalitarian, aggressive and imperialist Russia on one hand, and then you have about 35 European democracies on the other, with different types of memberships. Some of them are in the EU, some of them are in NATO, and some of them are in both, and some in neither. But this is very much, just like you put it, a question of values. You know, do you believe in democracy, freedom, rule of law, cooperation, fundamental rights, and human rights? And I actually think that the Russian military has been quite weak. I mean, of course, they haven't used chemical weapons or nuclear warheads, but the conventional warfare that Russia is doing right now, to be honest, doesn't incite much fear in the rest of us, I must admit.
And when you look at, obviously, the invasion between Russia and Ukraine, people talk a lot about, the government's aspect and the role that both the Russian government and the Ukrainian government play in this. But when you talk about specifically just everyday, Russians who are just in Russia, I guess, how do you go about and how do you think the world can go about, and if it's even possible at this point, given how, Russia's manipulated various things there to, show Russians the truth as to what's happening?
Yeah, I mean, that's the really tough part here, I mean, the first observation to make is that when you are in a war, people usually rally around the flag. It doesn't matter where you are. And of course, in Russia right now, second observation, misinformation is plenty. So they're getting a very one-sided view of the war. So when we see, for instance, a maternity hospital or theater being bombed or innocent civilians being slaughtered on the streets of Bucha, you don't get those images, you don't get those pictures in Russian media because they're basically closed in and shut down. Now, the question is whether this information will penetrate in the long run or not. The sad thing here is, final point, is that, ordinary Russians, they don't really understand what their government is doing. And of course, this is going to stigmatize Russia and Russians for decades to come. They're going to be the pariahs in many ways of this world. And this is sad. So I'm just wondering, I mean, you come from the land of ice hockey and, we have a lot of Russian players in the NHL. I mean, they get the real information and it's not a very good feeling for them either. So it's a really difficult situation. And I say this as someone who comes from a country, with 1,340 kilometers of border with Russia. Not as much as you guys have with the US, and I'm not comparing, but we're still talking Ontario and then some.
Just one final question to conclude. Do you foresee Ukraine being able to, win this, conflict without NATO involvement? And furthermore, do you see any path as to this ending anytime soon? Obviously, it's, I guess, a very simple question, but a very hard question at the same time.
Yeah, I think Ukraine has already won. They've won the hearts and minds of most of the world. Granted, there are countries that don't support Ukraine, but I think in our minds, Ukrainians are going to be the heroes. A little bit like Finland was during World War II when we fought the Russians in the Winter War. And this is something that's going to, stay on our hard drives. I mean, your generation, my generation will remember this forever. Then, what is a military victory in this kind of a situation? I guess a total military victory would be a pushback of Putin and Russia. Whether that happens or not, I really don't know. But final point is that, on the ceasefire that people talk about, I was involved in brokering the peace in Georgia in 2008. I was foreign minister of Finland at the time. And we got it done in 5 days. Now we are approaching day 50 in the war here. And I just don't see where Russia and Ukraine could agree. They're just so far apart. So this is where, idealism hits realism. So I don't see this ending anytime soon, but hopefully sometime during the summer.
Okay, that is former Finland Prime Minister, who has also held several other positions in Finland's cabinet, Alexander Stubb. Thank you so much for making the time and for providing some of your insight today.
Thank you, Ed. My pleasure.